at part 7 of my series on Corinthians called Lessons from Rowdy Christians. This will be the last one for now. As I mentioned a minute ago, in 2 weeks from today, we'll have a guest speaker, so I figured that was a good cutoff point. And if you go back to the beginning of this year, actually I preached 9 times on Corinthians. I will at the end of by today, because when we had our first communion service, I think way back in February, we looked in detail at Corinthians chapter 11, where the communion saying comes from that we use during our service. And then we went and looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 12 after that, so we'll make a total of 9. Let me give you a quick recap before we sum it all up, or wrap it all up today. When we looked at the section in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, where it talks, which we use when we celebrate the communion service, we realized that the early church was supposed to have viewed itself as an egalitarian body. So if you were a doctor on the outside, or just someone who was on unemployment, whether, to use the ancient times, if you were a wealthy person in the Roman Empire or a slave, when you came inside the church, they were supposed to be on par, because we were all one, part of the body of Christ. The following chapter, chapter 12, talked about spiritual gifts, and it made the same point. We all fit together. Nobody's gift is necessarily better than the others. Just like in a body, you need all the parts to work together. I'm going quickly. When we started the series officially, you might remember we looked at only the first 2 verses for part 1, where it used the word call 4 times. And from that very brief passage, we realized that the Christian religion, unlike some others, is an interrelational religion. God calls, God offers himself to us, and we respond. We open ourselves up back to God. That's it. Whether it's Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant, whether it's the time of Adam or the time of the new earth to come, there's that reciprocal relationship between God offering friendship and we saying yes, and walking forward in that friendship. In part 2, I called it the mustard seed people. And I introduced the question, how could it be, and then you're going back now 2,000 years, when the early church started, how many people were there in the church altogether? A few thousand? A few scattered congregations in places like about the size of us, and yet those were considered the exclusive people of God? How could we say that? And I think we got to the point of concluding that the reason that they were distinct is because they had a distinct character. They had a distinct understanding of who God was. This was not just the God of power who created the world. This was not just the God of justice who would overthrow enemies. This was a God who went to the cross. That makes a difference. Mustard seed people are the friends of that God. Then we talked about how, in part 3, God's goal for his church, if we're one, right? If we're friends of that kind of a God, then the goal should be unity. And the way to attain unity is sometimes giving up your own rights. Notice I said sometimes. There are some times where you don't give up rights. And I overheard Howard talking about this in the Sabbath school today. You have to know when to hold them and when to fold them, right? To quote Kenny Rogers. So, you need wisdom sometimes to know when to speak out and when to let it be. But the point is, the goal is unity. And if we all get on board with the spirit of service towards each other, that should be a beautiful experience. Part 4, we talked about how even though as Christians, because we're in Jesus Christ, we're secure. Our eternal status with God is assured. But yet it talks about judgment. So what do you do with that? We said God doesn't judge whether or not we're in or out at the judgment. That's already decided by us. If we choose Christ, we're in. But what he will evaluate is how we spent our time on earth, right? What did we do with our time? What did we accomplish? I said it was like building a house. I think Paul even uses that metaphor. It's a house that we get to build. At the judgment day, we find out whether the house will last and survive or not. But we will go through. In part 5, we talked about the fact that the Christian church is called to holiness. But often the word holiness in our culture brings up an image of all the things that we're not supposed to do. So I flipped that around and I called it positive holiness. And I described the things that we are supposed to do. We're supposed to be dedicated to each other. We're supposed to be focused on doing good stuff. We're supposed to be mature, using good judgment. Like Adam and Eve, they were given the planet, right? They were expected to become mature. And that leads into the part 6. When I was here 2 weeks ago, we talked about religion for grown-ups. A religion for grown-ups is where God actually gives us some choice in the matter. A religion for children, just like when we're children growing up, is where God says everything you're supposed to do from the minute you wake up until you go to bed at night. Where it's a religion based on rules and regulations. And we talked about a religion based on principles where God gives us some leeway to make judgment calls. So that's a quick synopsis. Today what I would like to do is wrap up by presenting what I think is the overall tone of the Christian life that comes across in the letter to the Corinthians. Now you might remember, I said at the beginning, if we had gone through every issue in Corinth and looked at the historical detail, we'd be here for years. And I figured there was just too much in the book to use that step-by-step method. So what I tried to do from the beginning is select themes. Sometimes individual themes, sometimes themes that repeat. What I would like to do now again is just kind of present a general sense of what the Christian life is that comes across in this letter. And I'll tell you, part of the way I came to this was not just by reading it carefully, but I listened to it in the car. You know, when I listen to it in the car, I hear big chunks of it. When I stay at home and read, I read a little bit and then I get an idea and I write, you know. So sometimes I might spend an hour on one verse. But in the car, I hear big swaths of the thing, maybe 2 or 3 chapters on the way to work. So I get the impression, and that's what I want to share with you today. An impression of what the nature and character of the church should be. If you notice the title, I called it Goodness, Greatness, Knowledge, and Wisdom. 4 words. Actually, I want to compare and contrast those words. Because the fact of the matter is, in my time of reading and listening to Corinthians, I discovered something. That the character of the Christian church is not greatness. The character of the Christian church is not greatness. The character of the Christian church does not prioritize knowledge for its own sake. The character of the Christian church is more along the lines of goodness and something that I would call wisdom. So we'll get into that. Take a look at the scripture reading again. Chapter 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Unfortunately, the microphones weren't set up, I think, for everybody to hear it clearly. So while you're turning there, I'll give you a little background. One of the problems that the early believers in Corinth faced was the issue of whether or not they should eat meat that was purchased in the marketplaces. In the marketplaces of their time, the meat was often sacrificed to idols first before it was sold. So the Christians at that time were in a dilemma because they didn't believe in idols anymore. They had turned away from idols. That was the whole idea of becoming Christians, joining up with a monotheistic Jewish religion represented through Jesus. So now what are they going to do? Some said we can't eat food sacrificed to idols because that would suggest that we believed in the idols, that we're in fellowship with the idols. Others in the church said, no, we're free from all of those regulations. We can do whatever we want. That's what's happening here. So I'll read the verses again, and then I want to extrapolate and suggest what it might mean for us. Chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. Now, concerning things sacrificed to idols. We know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. Very interesting, right? If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Now this is all a very strange use of language, especially in terms of the issue that was going on. Remember what I said, there were 2 groups. One group said, we understand now the freedom of Christ. We understand what's the big principles of the religion are. We don't have to worry about whether the food that we happen to buy in the marketplace has been sacrificed to an idol. Others said, no, that we're compromising our values. Same kinds of issues happen today. The ones who said we don't have to worry about it, those are the ones who actually had the right knowledge. Paul goes on to say that later. He says it later in the chapter. An idol is nothing. We don't have to worry about it. So he agrees with the ones who have knowledge. But he condemns their attitude. You get that? He says, when you have knowledge like that, all it does is make you arrogant. The opposite of knowledge, in his case here, is love. Because what does love do? Love takes into consideration the sensibilities of the other person. Love, even though they know they have the freedom themselves, a person with love will sacrifice the freedom for a moment, and so that the other person is not thrown off course. Right? That's what the rest of the chapter says. But the issue I want to highlight here is the difference between what I say is knowledge versus wisdom. In this case, knowledge is just knowing stuff and acting like a big shot because you know stuff. Wisdom is loving people and making the decision to act towards people in a way that it builds up peace and wellness. You see the difference there. So I'm using the word here, wisdom, in contrast to the knowledge that Paul is talking about here. In this story, the ones who had knowledge and were flaunting it, they were asserting for themselves what I'm going to call a form of greatness, right? We're better than you because we understand more than you. The contrast is love. Love is better than greatness. Now let me back up a little bit. Let me tell you how I tuned into this thought. As I mentioned a minute ago, I've been listening to the book, letting the imagery sink in. I've been reading different passages on their own, getting a sense of what really is the Christian ethic, right? What is the character of the Christian experience. But if you remember on the sermon where I talked about judgment, and I said we all get a chance to build our house, right? And at the end, the quality of our house will be judged. I made it a point to say God gives us resources. It's up to us to make of our lives something. And as I got to thinking about it, there was an unspoken idea in my mind when I think about the gifts that God gives us and the opportunities that God gives us and says, go make something of yourself. There's always the idea, maybe it's because of the culture we live in, maybe it was my upbringing, I don't know. But there was the idea that we should make of ourselves something great. That was like the unspoken idea, that we have all these resources now, go out and make something great of yourself. And I was thinking, as I'm reading this, is that really what we want? Is that really what God wants? For us to be great? What does He want us to be? Good first. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to become something great, either great in your field or even prominent in the world. I'm not condemning that. I'm just questioning our assumption. What does God really prefer? Greatness and all the glory that goes with greatness? Or does He prefer something different? Maybe goodness is something He likes better. That's why I put those words in the title. Is it greatness or is it goodness? You know, when we think about these people back then who had knowledge, and even now, people who have a lot of information, people who know a lot of stuff, who can win at Jeopardy, or who can get PhDs or whatever, there's a certain amount of glory that goes with that. Am I right? In our society, don't we value and look up to knowledge and information and people that have a lot of it? The word wisdom is not used in these three verses here, but the issue of knowledge is contrasted with love. Wisdom leads to love. Okay, so that was the first passage I want to look at. What I'm trying to do here today is actually a very difficult task. I'm trying to sum up the shape of the whole letter by looking at a few passages in particular and trying to pack it all in. All right? Let's take a look at another passage. This goes all the way back to chapter 1. You may remember when we were going through the beginning of the chapter, there's always in the ancient letters a greeting. And in this book, immediately after the greeting, Paul launched right into the first problem, the fact that the Corinthians were having division and disunity. And in the course of describing that, he brings up again these words, wisdom and something of its opposite. Now here, before we read this passage, I don't want you to get caught up in the terminology. When I'm using the word wisdom, I'm using it in a positive sense. Wisdom is that sense that we have, that attitude that we have, that helps us to make peace and right relationships, right? Knowledge, as it was used in chapter 8, is just information, having information and using it to your own advantage without caring about what the effects are. When we read in this passage in chapter 1, starting from verse 18, Paul is going to criticize wisdom, but he's not using wisdom in the same way I am here. He's using wisdom more like knowledge, okay? So just follow. Verse 18, it says, "For the word of the cross," this is the message that Paul proclaimed. He came and preached a crucified Messiah. "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the cleverness I will set aside." So he's saying that there's something about the gospel message of a leader who died that overthrows the so-called wisdom of everybody else. And he asks the question, where's the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? So he's contrasting the wisdom of this world versus something different. "For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached," the foolishness of the message preached, "to save those who believe." And then he gets to the core of it. Jews ask for signs. In other words, that was their orientation. They wanted to see some supernatural sign that would suggest that this was really the Messiah. But the Greeks, or the Gentiles, searched for wisdom because that's where they came out of. You heard of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle? The Greek world was all about that. The Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, this is a stumbling block because that's not what they expected. And to the Gentiles, this doesn't make any sense at all. It's foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Now again, I'm trying to pack a lot in here. So I just read a long passage. I hope it didn't get you more confused than anything. But the point is, it has that same contrast. There's a contrast between head wisdom, as he uses the term here, head knowledge, wanting to understand everything, wanting to say, we got it all right, we have all the information, we're better than you because we understand things. God's wisdom is completely different. Has nothing to do with what you know. It has to do with what you do. Going to the cross, that was God's wisdom. Because what does service and sacrifice accomplish? It accomplishes love. It accomplishes peace. It accomplishes relationship. God's foolishness is actually wiser than all the knowledge we can ever get. And that's the contrast I see here. The cross is real wisdom. It's not greatness. Get this. It's not greatness in the way we use the term. It's not glorious in the way we use the term. We use the word glory as if it's something that we should be proud of. Somebody's a big shot. You win, what is that? Dancing with the Stars or whatever show there is, and you get glory, right? That's not the kind of glory of the cross. It's different. It's a glory, and it's a meaningfulness that comes from sheer goodness. You see what I'm trying to say here? There's a contrast. And as I listen to Corinthians in the car, as I read it, it's almost communicated to me in this, almost by osmosis, this change in thinking. It's not the usual way to think. We think in terms of greatness. God thinks in terms of goodness. We think in terms of knowledge and all the glory that comes from that. God thinks in terms of what can we do to make the world a better place. There's a definite contrast here. See, wisdom to God is not just having a lot of information. Wisdom to God is having an attitude that makes things right. You follow what I'm saying? It's completely different than the way we look at things. God's wisdom, get this, I'm going to use some other words to try to convey the idea. God's wisdom is quiet. It's not loud. It's not noisy. God's wisdom, in a way, is hidden. It's the kind that you don't see. It's not dramatic. Are you starting to get it a little bit? You know, a few years ago, I don't remember where Atlanta found it, but she found a DVD that she ordered. It's called Happy. And what it is, it's a documentary DVD. It's not a fiction story. It's a documentary about what makes people happy. There's a new field in psychology called positive psychology, and that's what this DVD is about. For many decades, almost a century, people studied what was wrong with people psychologically. And then a researcher about 20 years ago or so decided, let me study what's right with people. What actually makes people happy? So this DVD is like a survey of the research, and it has a lot of stories in it about people. Some of them extremely poor, but happy. Some of them who went through catastrophic, terrible experiences, but are happy. And it kind of surveys what happiness is about. But there's one segment of the DVD about a country that maybe not all of us have even ever heard of. It's called Bhutan. Have you ever heard of Bhutan?
Yes.
Bhutan. For a long time, it was a closed-off country. It didn't allow people in. They didn't want to interact with the other part of the world. They opened up now. But they're on a different track still. And they interviewed one of the ministers, one of the government officials in Bhutan. They all speak English pretty well. I guess they were colonized by the British at one point. But in any case, he talks about how most countries strive to have the highest GDP, gross domestic product, right? Or gross national product, GNP sometimes they call it. What is that? That is, in other words, our goal is to produce as much as we can. Produce manufacturing, service industries, grow crops, make inventions. You know, their goal is to produce so we can get more income. That's the goal of a country. He said in Bhutan, they decided they didn't want that. They chose instead to pursue gross national happiness. And what that means is, sometimes they turn away from opportunities to make money. Like they have rivers that come out of the Himalayan mountains that they could easily dam for hydroelectric power that they could sell to neighboring countries. But they realize that if they do that, they will displace people's homes. They will flood ancient historical sites, temples, and things like that. They said, so we're going to lose a little money, but we're going to maintain a quality of life. And I like that. The reason I'm bringing that up here is because it's a different topic. It's not exactly the topic I'm on, but it's similar. You know why? Because gross national product or gross domestic product is something that we consider showy. You know, it's showy. It makes a big splash. It's glorious. But what they wanted was something that's quiet. They said, okay, maybe we won't have as big houses. Maybe we won't all have brand new cars. Maybe we won't all have the latest fashion. But you know what we'll have? We'll be happy. You see? And which one is essential? More essential when you think about it. And I use that word essential in two senses. Essential means it comes from the word essence, right? What's the essence of something? The inner nature of the thing. And when we use the word essential, we use the word it's something that's necessary. So I see them making this choice. They had a vision of what they wanted for their country. And so because of that vision, they're able to say yes to some things and no to some other things. They don't need to be over the top, glorious in their production, right? Their mode of production. Because they had a picture. They had a vision. You know, when I think about some of the issues that Paul had to deal with in the churches, not just Corinth, but all the churches, how was it that he was able to come up with such good advice all the time? I think it's the same thing. He had a picture of what the ideal should be. And once he knows what the goal is, then he can make a statement of how you get there. And from what I can tell, the goal of the Christian church was to be at one with each other, at peace with each other, to create a place where everyone is respected and considered on equal ground. How do you do that? Always by fighting for your rights? How do you do that? Always by arguing that your point of view is correct? Now, there's sometimes you have to do that, like we said in Sabbath school. There comes a time where you say, no, this is not something I can compromise on. This is important enough for me. But I think we need to be really careful about those things. Because how do we know when we're right, whether we're right or wrong half the time, or most of the time? One more passage. This is the most famous passage of all in 1 Corinthians. And because it's so overused, I almost wanted to avoid it. But I got to include the first 3 verses. Can anybody guess which chapter I'm talking about? 1 Corinthians 13. You hear this all the time at weddings. You see it on, placards here and there. It's almost become trite. But I want to just look at the first 3 verses because it illustrates what I'm talking about. This contrast between what we value and I think what God really values. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. He's talking about people who are able to speak in languages, ecstatic languages, spiritual experience. Even if I could use angels' languages, if I don't have love, I'm just a noisy gong. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I do not have love, I'm nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor and surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. So there's that contrast here between greatness and glory on one hand and what really counts on the other. Look at it. Speaking in tongues, that's something that everybody can look at. Wow, how great that person is. They have the best gift of tongues of all. Being able to understand all the mysteries of the Bible and to be able to explain all prophecies. That's a person that we can look up to. Oh, they have a certain amount of greatness. I like the one about miraculous faith. Faith enough to make a mountain move, right? You know what word came to mind when I thought about that? Celebrity. I haven't used that word yet. I'm going to get back to it in a minute. But you could be a celebrity if you could make mountains move, or buildings even, or even a car. And then the last one, if I give up everything for the wrong reason, I might get some notoriety, but it's not what God is looking for. None of those things. And that's the issue that kept coming back to me as I read this book. God is looking for goodness. God is looking for wisdom that makes things work. God is not looking for greatness that attracts a lot of attention. God is not looking for knowledge just for its own sake so we can have glory to ourselves. He's not looking for celebrity. Think about that word. Our whole culture is oriented around celebrity nowadays. Am I right? Anytime some famous actor or even moderately famous person dies, you see on Facebook all of this outpouring of, oh, I'm going to miss that person. They never even knew the person. They don't even know what that person is like in real life. Am I saying correct? But they're famous. So big deal. Because we celebrate celebrity. It's a redundancy right there. Our culture celebrates image and bigness and greatness. But God celebrates the opposite. That's why, as I said, I'm trying to sum up the impression I got from the whole book. God's not looking for celebrity. God's not even calling us to greatness, although if it comes along, that's fine too. God is looking for goodness and love. So let me finish with a story. I read this in a book. A person was telling about how human beings like to tell stories, and we like to exaggerate things. And it's a story of when he was a teenager, talking about his father. He loved his father. His father had come from Russia. They had to flee Russia during the Second World War. And he had been in the war, it says. And so when he was talking to the kids on the school grounds, he said, my father could carry a gun. My father's really good with guns. He was a war hero, he says. He said, my father had to leave a promising academic career because he had to flee the Soviet Union, or Russia, before the war. He said a number of things about his father. Oh, and his father is an engineer. This is what he told the kids on the playground. The fact of the matter was, his father finished high school, and he was a good student, He was in the war, but he doesn't know whether or not he was a war hero. He once saw him win a contest shooting at a target, and it said he won a turkey because he was the one that hit the bullseye. And he wasn't an engineer, he was a machinist. But he told the story. Why? Because what we want to do is extol the greatness and glory of people. But here's the part that got me. He says in the next page, I definitely never mentioned to my schoolmates the many things that my father did that were actually heroic, but not quite as exciting for school-age boys. Listen to this. He says, my father rushed from his dirty job without changing clothes to get to all of my Little League games. He held me in the middle of the night, catching my vomit in a napkin. He worked himself ragged weekend after weekend for months and years to turn our tattered and tiny house into something a bit nicer. And he and my mother chose to put up some paneling in the basement to serve as their bedroom, so my sister and I could each have our own bedroom in our own house. He resigned himself to working long hours in an unfulfilling job, which at best he tolerated, to make sure that we had a roof on our heads, clothes on our backs, cars to drive, and the opportunity to go to college. You get it? He portrayed his father as something great and glorious because that's what you do, because that's what we esteem in life. But his father was good. That's what I'm trying to get at here. We live in a glory culture. But if you read the New Testament, it's not interested in that. It's not interested in that. Yeah, maybe along the way, if you get to be a famous person accidentally, that's all right. You know, as long as you use it the right way. But that's not really what we're aiming for. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. There's a difference between greatness and goodness. And as I've read through the letter to the Corinthians and listened to it in the car and let it kind of seep over me for the last couple of months, this new idea kind of hit me. And it's different. It's different than what we're used to. It almost turns the whole thing upside down. We live in a celebrity culture. But God is not calling us to that. God is calling us to goodness. God is calling us to wisdom. God is calling us to the type of actions that lead to love and peace and unity. And you know what? The good thing about it all, I've said this before and I'll end the series on this note. That's how God is.